The rain started the way trouble always starts in Ironville, quietly, like it had somewhere better to be, and then all at once. Dessa Calloway stood on the shoulder of Route 9 with her hazards blinking into the dark, one hand on the hood of a car that had died without warning or apology. She'd already called the tow line twice. The first time, a recording. The second time, a bored dispatcher who told her someone was on the way, which in Ironville could mean anywhere from 10 minutes to never. She hated waiting more than she hated being wrong, and tonight she was about to be both. Headlights swung around the bend, high beams mounted crooked on a tow truck that looked like it had survived several arguments with several ditches. It rattled to a stop behind her car, and a man climbed out without hurrying, the way people only move when they've stopped being afraid of anything on this stretch of road. He was unremarkable in every way a person can be unremarkable. Gray jacket, gray gloves, a face that didn't ask to be looked at twice. He walked to her car, crouched by the front wheel, and said nothing for almost a full minute. "You're going to tell me it's the alternator," Dessa said, arms crossed against the cold. "Everyone always tells me it's the alternator." "It's not the alternator." He didn't look up. "Somebody loosened your brake line recently, deliberately." She laughed before she could stop herself short, disbelieving. "Right, and I suppose you know that because you're secretly a detective." He finally looked at her. Whatever answer he had, he decided to keep it. "I know it because I've been fixing trucks since before you could walk, and this wasn't where. This was hands." She didn't like the way that landed in her chest. She didn't like, either, the flicker of recognition that crossed his face when he glanced at the boxing gym decal still peeling off her back windshield. A decal for a gym that had closed 9 years ago, one her father used to own. "You know that gym?" she asked. "I know the man who used to run it," he said, and left it there, already walking back toward his truck. She would spend the rest of the night telling herself that was nothing. She would spend the rest of the month learning exactly how wrong she was. She thought she'd called a tow truck. What she'd actually done, though she wouldn't understand this for weeks, was reach into a part of her father's life he had spent 15 years trying to bury, and pull it, gently, back into the light. The tow itself took 20 minutes, most of it silent. Dessa watched the driver in the mirror of the cab, the way his eyes moved constantly between the road, the mirrors, and something behind them she couldn't identify. He drove like a man checking for a tail, not like a man finishing a shift. "You've got a name?" she finally asked. "Sila's." "Sila's what?" "Just Sila's on the clock." A pause, almost a smile. "It's a small town. People collect last names like gossip." "You knew my dad," she said, not a question. "I knew of him. Marcus Calloway doesn't forget people, and people don't forget him. Whether or not that's a mutual arrangement is between you two." "That's not an answer." "No," Silas agreed, "it isn't." He dropped her car at Denny's garage, wrote up the ticket with unhurried, careful handwriting, and when she reached for her wallet he shook his head. Owner comps first tows for anybody with a Callaway sticker on their car. Long story. Ask your father. He was gone before she could argue, taillights disappearing into the rain, and Dessa stood in the garage bay holding a slip of paper with a company name on it. Ridgeline Towing, feeling, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, genuinely unsettled. And look, most of us would have done exactly what she did. We chalk it up to small-town weirdness and go to bed. It's easy to miss the moment your life quietly changes direction, because it rarely announces itself. It just idles behind you with its hazards on, waiting for you to notice. The warning came 2 days later, from a woman named Ruth who'd run the counter at the Ironville diner for as long as anyone could remember. Dessa had mentioned Silas's name over coffee, mostly out of curiosity, mostly expecting nothing. Ruth's hand stopped halfway through wiping the counter. "You rode with Silas." "He towed my car. Why does everyone say his name like that?" "Like what?" "Like it means something." Ruth set the rag down. For a moment she looked like she might actually answer. Instead she said quietly, "Honey, you don't know who you just called," and turned back to the register before Dessa could ask another question. Dessa drove home more frustrated than frightened. She hated half-answers. Her father had raised her on the idea that hesitation was its own kind of lie, and now everyone in town seemed determined to hesitate at her. That night she brought it to him directly. Her father, Marcus Calloway, once a middleweight who'd fought his way to the edge of a title before retiring under circumstances he had never fully explained, not to reporters, not to her. He was at the kitchen table, sorting mail, when she said the name. His hand stopped moving. "Silas towed my car Tuesday night," she said. "He knew about the gym, he knew you. Dad, who is he?" Marcus set down the envelope in his hand, with the exaggerated care of a man buying himself time. "Did he tell you who he was?" "No." Something in her father's shoulders loosened just slightly, like a held breath finally allowed to leave. "Then he still trusts you," he said. "Trusts me with what?" He didn't answer. He picked the mail back up, and the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. Quick reality check, because I think about this one a lot. If a tow truck driver knows more about your family history than half your own relatives do, that's usually not a coincidence you should shrug off. That's information. And information, in a town like Ironville, is currency nobody spends by accident. Over the following week, Dessa started noticing things she couldn't unnotice. A grizzled man in a leather vest, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of a motorcycle rather than born, walked into Denny's garage to pick up a part, saw Silas at the workbench, and immediately straightened like he'd been called to attention. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. The posture said everything. At the diner, Ruth refused again to charge Silas for his coffee, waving off his money with a look that wasn't affection so much as reverence, careful and old. A teenager in a battered denim cut, clearly new to whatever world these people orbited, jogged up to Silas in the parking lot and said, too loud, too excited, "Hey, is it true you used to be called the—" before an older biker clapped a hand over the kid's mouth and steered him away, apologizing to no one in particular. Dessa started keeping a mental list. She hated that she was keeping a mental list. She hated more that the list kept growing. The final piece, for now, came from an old cardboard box at the back of her father's closet. A box she wasn't supposed to be looking through, filled with photographs from a career he rarely discussed. In one, faded and creased, a much younger Marcus stood outside a motorcycle shop with his arms slung around a man whose face she almost didn't recognize because it belonged to someone 20 years younger and considerably more reckless looking. It was Silas. Standing beside him in the photograph's corner was a rough iron emblem bolted above the shop door, a stylized wheel wrapped in barbed chain. She didn't know what it meant yet. She would. Iron MC Riders wasn't a gang, not the way movies like to paint it, and not the way the antagonist of this story would eventually insist it was, either. It was older than that, stranger than that, and far more human. It had rules, actual rules, argued over at actual meetings, the kind that got amended and re-amended by men and women who disagreed about almost everything except the club itself. It had a retired school teacher named Boone who kept an embarrassing, meticulous collection of miniature die-cast motorcycles in his saddlebag, and would talk your ear off about scale accuracy if you let him. It had a mechanic named Pepper who complained, loudly and constantly, about the terrible coffee Silas insisted on brewing at the clubhouse, and who nonetheless drank 3 cups of it every single meeting out of what could only be described as spite loyalty. It had veterans who thought the club should stay small and quiet. It had younger members who thought it should grow, modernize, make noise. It had disagreements that got heated and never got violent, because that, more than anything, was the thing the club's founder had insisted on above all else. The founder's name had been Emmett Voss. He'd been dead for 15 years, and almost nobody in Ironville, outside the club itself, knew that the man who'd quietly led Iron MC riders ever since, never wearing the title, never taking the seat at the head of the table, never once letting his name attached to the organization in any way that could be written down, was the same man currently teaching Dessa Calloway's stubborn little sedan how to survive another winter. Here's where the story usually gets lazy, where the quiet guy turns out to be tough, everyone gasps, roll credits. But that's not actually the interesting part, and it's not what made Silas different. His advantage was never that he could scare people into behaving. It was that he almost never needed to. He'd learned, a long time before Dessa met him, exactly when intimidation was a tool and when it was just noise. And her father had once given her nearly the same lesson, without either of them realizing the two men were saying the same thing. His name was Grant Ashford, and he did not consider himself a villain. He considered himself the last living Voss, though he carried his mother's name, and he considered Marcus Calloway the reason his father was in the ground. 15 years ago, on the night of what should have been the final fight of Marcus's career, a bout that would have set up a title shot he'd spent a decade chasing, three men jumped him in the parking lot behind the arena. Men hired, though Marcus never learned by whom, to make sure he never stepped in that ring healthy. Emmett Voss, who'd come that night simply to watch a fight, waded in to help a man he barely knew get up off the pavement and took a blow meant for someone else. He never woke up. Silas had been 23 years old, riding with Emmett as his second, and he had spent every year since believing, with the particular cruelty young men reserve for themselves, that he should have reached his mentor half a second sooner. He stepped away from any visible leadership of the club that night. He let the club's structure absorb the loss quietly, the way it absorbed most things, and he became, by deliberate design, a man nobody looked at twice. A tow truck driver, a name on a work order, somebody's cousin maybe, if you didn't ask too many questions. Grant Ashford had grown up asking questions nobody would answer, and had grown into a man who'd built a comfortable, respectable life as a real estate developer with a specific, unfinished piece of business. Proof, real and legal, of who exactly had been present the night his father died, proof that could unravel Iron MC Rider's land holdings, its clubhouse, its charitable trust, everything Emmett had built, if Grant could just demonstrate the club's true leadership, had been concealed from the state for over a decade. He didn't need revenge in the cartoonish sense. He needed documents. He needed witnesses. And he had recently learned, through channels he wasn't proud of, that Marcus Calloway's own daughter might unknowingly be sitting on the one thing that could finally hand it to him. An old photograph, an old ledger, anything with Silas Voss's real name and Emmett's signature both on it, still tucked away somewhere in the Calloway house. Grant believed, sincerely, that he was owed this. He believed Marcus had let his father die and had spent 15 years profiting from the silence that followed. He was wrong about most of it. He was not wrong about all of it, and that was what made him dangerous. The first real move came disguised as an accident. A man, checking the meter, outside the Calloway house, who spent considerably more time examining the garage window than any meter required. Dessa noticed him only because her father's old training had taught her to notice things like that. People who watch a house the way a fighter watches an opponent's shoulders instead of their eyes. She mentioned it to Silas the next time she saw him, half expecting him to shrug it off. He didn't. He asked three quiet, specific questions: what time, what he was wearing, which direction he left in, and something in his stillness afterward told her this wasn't a new problem to him. It was an old one, arriving on schedule. "You know who that was," she said. "I know who sent him." "Then tell me." "Not yet." He said it without arrogance, the way a man diffuses something rather than dismisses it. "Right now the safest thing you can do is nothing dramatic. Go to work. Go to the diner. Let people see you're not scared." "I am scared." "Good," Silas said. Scared and careless are different things. Your father taught you that already, whether or not you noticed him teaching it. She hadn't noticed. She would, later, recognize the sentence for what it was, the closest thing to a confession Silas had offered so far. Over the following days, without her fully realizing it was happening, things simply began going more smoothly than they should have. A delivery of flowers that should have taken 3 days to a shop across town arrived within the hour because the courier, a stocky man with a faded club patch tattooed inside his forearm, happened to be in the neighborhood. A parking spot outside her office that was never open was suddenly, consistently open. A man who'd been loitering near her car for 2 evenings straight simply stopped appearing, and nobody Dessa asked seemed to know exactly why, though several people got oddly evasive when she pushed. Silas never announced that he was managing any of it. He never took credit. People simply responded when he was in the room, the way a room's temperature responds to an open door, without ever being told to. If you're enjoying where this is headed, go ahead and subscribe now. Because what happens in the next stretch completely rewrites who you think the actual hero of this story is. And I promise you haven't guessed it yet. It happened, of all places, at Boone's 60th birthday, held in the gravel lot behind the Iron MC Clubhouse under a string of Christmas lights nobody had bothered to take down since December. Boone, the 6'4" veteran with forearms like cinder blocks, and a face that had clearly lost more than one negotiation with a fist, unveiled his newest addition to the miniature motorcycle collection, with the solemnity of a man presenting a newborn. It was a 1/18 scale replica of a 1974 Triumph, and he described its historical accuracy for 11 uninterrupted minutes while Pepper loudly speculated, to anyone who'd listen, that Boone had the emotional range of a man who collects toys and the physical range of a man who could remove your spine. Dessa, who'd been invited almost accidentally and had expected to feel like an intruder, found herself laughing for the first time in a week when Pepper cornered Silas by the drink cooler and staged, with theatrical outrage, a formal complaint about the clubhouse coffee. "It tastes like a tire fire," Pepper announced to the yard at large. "I've had better coffee out of a gas station that closed in 2004. "You've had 3 cups, Silas said mildly, not looking up from the grill. "I'm building a legal case. Against coffee. Against negligence." Even Grant Ashford's shadow, somewhere out there watching this town from a rented office with a corkboard full of surveillance photos, would have looked almost comical set against the sight of grown, dangerous-looking adults arguing about a coffee maker, while a man turned burgers and a teenager begged, unsuccessfully, to be allowed to ride his first solo lap around the lot. It was here, laughing at Pepper's increasingly elaborate coffee grievances, that Dessa first understood something important. Whatever these people were, whatever Silas actually was underneath the gray jacket and the quiet manner, none of it made them monsters. It made them, if anything, more human than most people she'd met. The truth came out on a Tuesday, in the cab of the tow truck, during a drive that should have taken 10 minutes and instead took 40, because Dessa finally asked the question directly and Silas, for once, didn't deflect. "Who are you?" she said, "really?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached beneath the bench seat and pulled out an old steel toolbox, dented and scratched, and set it in her lap. Inside, beneath a layer of actual tools, was a folded photograph. The same photograph she'd found in her father's closet, only this copy was older, softer at the creases, clearly handled far more often. Beneath it sat a small emblem, hand-forged, the wheel and chain design she'd seen bolted above the motorcycle shop door in the picture. And beneath that, a leather-bound ledger with a name written on the inside cover in handwriting that had clearly aged along with its owner, Silas Emmett Voss. "Emmett Voss was your father," she said, understanding arriving in pieces. "He wasn't my father by blood. He was better than that. He found me when I had nothing, gave me a trade, gave me a name that meant something, and I got him killed by being half a second too slow the one night it mattered. That's not. I know what it isn't now. I didn't know it for a long time. He kept his eyes on the road. I let this club believe their leader disappeared instead of admitting he was standing right in front of them driving a tow truck, too ashamed to lead anyone anywhere. Your father knows all of it. He's carried a version of that same shame for 15 years for different reasons. Ask him when you're ready. He owes you that more than I do. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was more than a partial answer, and for the first time, Dessa believed she was finally being told the truth as Silas understood it, not the truth as he'd decided she could handle. Marcus Calloway had spent 15 years telling himself a very specific story, that the men who attacked him that night had been sent by a rival promoter angry about a fixed betting line, nothing more. A random, ugly coincidence of violence that happened to cost a stranger his life. He had never let himself look too closely at who might have actually wanted him hurt badly enough to hire 3 men to do it, because looking too closely meant admitting he'd known, for years before that fight, that his manager had been laundering money through the gym, money that belonged, in no small part, to people connected to men Grant Ashford's father had once done business with, before Emmett Voss had cut all of it loose and gone legitimate, disgusted with what the arrangement had become. Marcus had suspected and said nothing, because saying something would have ended his career before it started, and he was 26 and desperate and certain he could simply outrun the consequences. He hadn't outrun them. He'd simply moved them 15 years down the road, onto his daughter's doorstep, in the shape of a man checking a meter that didn't need checking. When Dessa confronted him with all of it, Silas's name, Emmett's, the ledger, the photograph, her father sat at the kitchen table for a long time before he spoke. "I should have told you a version of this a long time ago," he said. "Not because you needed protecting from it, because you needed the truth more than you needed my comfort, and I gave you the wrong one for 15 years. Why didn't you ever confront the people who did it?" "Because I was ashamed, and shame is a coward's math. It always adds up to silence." He looked up at her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, he looked genuinely afraid of something that wasn't a man twice his size in a ring. "Grant Ashford isn't wrong that I owe somebody something, Dessa. He's just wrong about who and wrong about how to collect it." Grant Ashford's final move came not as violence, but as an ultimatum, delivered through a lawyer's letter that landed on Marcus's kitchen table on a Thursday morning. Hand over any documentation proving Silas Voss's identity and his ongoing, undisclosed leadership of Iron MC Riders, or face a public filing that would drag Marcus's old suspicions about the gym's finances into a courtroom alongside it, ending both his reputation and any peace the club had built for itself over 15 careful years. Silas had a decision to make, and for the first time, everyone around him could see him actually making it, rather than quietly managing it from 3 steps ahead. He could stay hidden, let Marcus take whatever fallout came, protect the club's structure by protecting his own anonymity, and walk away from Ironville entirely if it came to that. He'd done harder things than starting over somewhere new. Or he could step finally into the light, confirm publicly what he'd spent 15 years denying even to himself, that he was Emmett Voss's chosen successor, that he'd led the club from the shadows out of grief rather than strategy, and that hiding hadn't protected anyone. It had just delayed a reckoning that had been coming for Marcus, and for Grant, since the night Emmett died. He called a meeting at the clubhouse. Boone came. Pepper came, uncharacteristically without a single complaint about the coffee. Ruth came, still in her diner apron. Marcus came and stood at the back of the room like a man attending his own trial. "I've let this club believe a story for 15 years because the true one made me feel like I didn't deserve to lead you," Silas told them. "That was mine to carry, and I carried it wrong. I'm done hiding what happened to Emmett, and I'm done letting Grant Ashford use my silence as a weapon against people who never hurt his father. including a man in this room who spent as long punishing himself as I have." Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. Something between the two men settled that night that 15 years of separate, private shame had never allowed. Grant Ashford arrived at the clubhouse the following evening, expecting a fight, and found, instead, a room full of people who already knew exactly who he was and exactly what he'd lost. "You've spent 15 years building a case against a man who wasn't in that parking lot," Silas told him, calm in the specific way that had unsettled Dessa the very first night they'd met. "I was there. I'll answer for what I did and didn't do. Marcus made mistakes that got other people hurt around him, and he spent this week finally admitting that out loud, to the people it affects, instead of to a lawyer. That's more accountability than your filing was ever going to force out of anybody." "That doesn't give me my father back," Grant said, and for the first time his voice cracked around the edges of something that wasn't calculation at all. "No," Silas agreed. "Nothing does. I've known that longer than you have." There was no brawl, no dramatic display of numbers and leather jackets closing ranks the way the worst version of this story might have written it. There was, instead, a long and difficult conversation, Marcus finally nomming, out loud and on record, the people who'd profited from his silence years ago. Silas offering Grant something he hadn't expected, which was simply the truth, delivered without flinching. And Grant Ashford, robbed of the villain he'd built in his head, left with nothing to do but sit with a grief that had outlived its target. He didn't get an apology that erased anything. He got an honest account, and eventually, months later, a standing invitation to Emmett Voss's memorial ride, which he did not attend the first year and did attend the second. And that's the part I think a lot of stories like this one get wrong. They want a clean villain and a clean ending, everybody sorted neatly into good and bad. Real reckonings are messier than that. Sometimes the best you get isn't victory. It's just everyone finally telling the truth in the same room at the same time. Dessa's father sold the last of the gym's old equipment to a nonprofit boxing program for teenagers and started coaching there on weekends. The first time in 15 years he'd stood in a ring without flinching at the memory attached to it. Iron MC riders held a vote, the first formal one in over a decade, and confirmed Silas as their leader in name as well as fact. A title he accepted on the condition that the club's finances and its charitable work be open to public record, permanently, so no one could ever again hold its secrecy over anyone's head. Ruth stopped charging Silas for coffee, out of habit more than reverence now, though she still refused to explain the tradition to anyone who asked. And Dessa, who had spent her whole life believing her father's old lesson, never confused noise with strength, found she finally understood it the way he'd meant it all along. Silas had never once needed to raise his voice, threaten a man, or announce a single thing about himself, and he had still managed to change the direction of an entire town simply by choosing, eventually, to stop hiding. She still called him for toes occasionally, even after her car stopped breaking down quite so often. He still showed up without hurrying. He still didn't say much. But the quiet, she'd learned, had never been emptiness. It had been a man carrying an entire world on his shoulders, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask him to put it down. She had asked, without meaning to, on a rainy night on Route 9. It turned out to be the most important wrong number she never actually dialed.